What if the greatest hero who ever lived was also history's most tragic murderer? What if every impossible victory, every monster defeated, every journey to the edge of the world and beyond was nothing more than a desperate, doomed attempt to wash blood from hands that would never be clean? Tonight we follow Hercules through the 12 labors that made him legend. But these weren't triumphs. They were penance. They were the price of a single night when divine madness turned love into slaughter, when a hero's hands murdered his own children, when the line between protector and destroyer vanished in an instant of divinely orchestrated horror. The 12 labors aren't just about monsters and impossible tasks. They're about what happens after the unforgivable, about whether redemption exists for those who've crossed lines that shouldn't exist, about a man who descended into literal death itself, searching for something: atonement, peace, forgiveness, meaning that 12 impossible tasks could never quite deliver. So breathe deeply and settle into this ancient story that refuses to stay ancient. Let the weight of these millennia-old truths settle around you like twilight. We're about to walk a path soaked in blood and glory, following a hero who learned that sometimes the hardest battles aren't against lions or hydras or three-headed dogs, but against the monster of your own past. The guilt that won't die no matter how many times you try to kill it. The 12 labors are waiting, and they have lessons about suffering, persistence, and incomplete redemption that resonate as powerfully now as they did 3,000 years ago. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin where all heroic falls begin, with love, loss, and a god's jealousy that knew no bounds. The tragic beginning, when heroes become monsters. Before Hercules strangled a lion with his bare hands, before he captured death's guardian and returned alive, before his name meant impossible made possible, he was just Heracles, a child born into a war between gods that he never asked to join. According to our earliest sources, Hesiod's Theogony, Homer's Iliad, Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, and Euripides' tragic plays, Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman of exceptional virtue. But Alcmene was already married to Amphitryon, and she was faithful. Zeus's solution? Deception. He took the form of her husband while Amphitryon fought in a war, and Alcmene, believing this was truly her husband returned, welcomed him to her bed. This divine rape by fraud would echo through mythology for millennia, setting Heracles on a collision course with Hera's hatred before he even drew his first breath. When Alcmene conceived, ancient tradition holds she carried twins, Heracles, son of Zeus, and Iphicles, son of her actual husband, conceived the following night. One mortal, one something more. The difference was apparent from the beginning. Zeus, drunk on power and pride, made the kind of careless boast that destroys lives. According to Homer and multiple later sources, he swore before all Olympus that a son of his bloodline would be born that day who would rule over the house of Perseus and all Mycenae. It was an oath binding even upon gods. Hera, goddess of marriage and childbirth, was listening, and she was not powerless. Using her divine influence over childbirth, well documented in Hesiod, and confirmed across ancient sources, she delayed Alcmene's labor while hastening the birth of another Perseus line child, Eurystheus, born to different parents. Eurystheus entered the world mere hours before Heracles. By Zeus's own oath, he would rule. The child who should have been a prince was born to serve a lesser man, and Hera's revenge had barely begun. The serpent's first blood. When Heracles was 8 months old, Hera sent 2 enormous serpents to murder the twins in their crib. This episode is preserved in detail by Pindar, Nemean Odes, Apollodorus, Theocritus, and multiple artistic traditions from the 6th century BCE onward. The snakes slithered through darkness, wound into the cradle, began to squeeze the life from infant flesh. Iphicles woke screaming. His cries brought their parents running. But when Amphitryon and Alcmene reached the nursery, they found something that confirmed every supernatural suspicion. Heracles hadn't screamed. He'd grasped both serpents by their throats, one in each tiny fist, and strangled them while his parents watched in stunned silence. When the snakes went limp, the baby laughed. This wasn't just unusual strength. It was an omen. The education of a demigod. Apollodorus and other sources tell us Amphitryon gave Heracles the education befitting a prince and hero. He learned literature, music, philosophy. Castor taught him swordsmanship. Eurytus taught him archery. Autolycus taught him wrestling. Linus tried to teach him the lyre, until Heracles, frustrated by criticism, struck his music teacher with the instrument and killed him instantly. Apollodorus calls this an accident, a moment of adolescent temper from someone who didn't yet understand the mortal consequences of demigod strength. But it foreshadowed something darker. Heracles would spend his entire life surrounded by death, often inflicted by his own hands, whether he intended it or not. As he grew to adulthood, Heracles became everything Zeus had bragged he would be. He stood taller than any man, built like a fortress. Ancient sources speak of him lifting boulders that teams of oxen couldn't budge, wrestling rivers into new courses. Based on the consistent testimony of multiple independent sources, it appears he possessed not just overwhelming physical power, but also considerable cunning when strategy was required, and surprising eloquence when diplomacy might work. He married Megara, Princess of Thebes, daughter of King Creon. She gave him children. Sources disagree whether 3 or more, but all agree Heracles loved them fiercely. For a time, he knew happiness. He defended Thebes from enemies, protected the weak, used his strength in service of others. He was, by every measure that mattered to the Greeks, a true hero. That's when Hera struck. Madness. The night everything ended, the queen of the gods had never forgotten her hatred. Heracles' happiness was an insult. Every achievement reminded her of Zeus's betrayal. So she waited until he had everything to lose, then sent madness. Euripides' tragedy. Heracles provides our most detailed ancient account, and the horror lies in the specific nature of the curse, not random violence, but targeted delusion. Hera made Heracles see his beloved family as enemies, as monsters threatening him that had to be destroyed. His wife became a minion invader. His children became the spawn of his enemies. What happened next is preserved fragmentarily, but consistently across sources. In the grip of this curse, Heracles killed his own children. Some versions say he threw them into fire. Others claim he shot them with arrows or struck them down with his club. The method matters less than the result. When Hera's madness finally lifted, Heracles stood amid the broken bodies of his sons, their blood on his hands, their lives extinguished by his own strength. Megara's fate varies. Euripides has her die that same night. Other traditions preserve her survival, but the marriage was broken beyond repair. Either way, everything Heracles had built, everything he'd loved, was destroyed in one night of divinely inflicted horror. The oracle's answer. When awareness returned, when he understood what he'd done, Heracles' grief was absolute. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus, describe him wandering like a wild thing, refusing human contact, barely eating, contemplating suicide. The strongest man in the world was broken not by any external enemy, but by the knowledge of his own actions, by hands that had protected thousands, but destroyed what he loved most. Suicide offered no solution. Greek belief held that self-murderers faced eternal punishment, and besides, his death wouldn't resurrect his children. There had to be another path, if any path to redemption existed for such crimes. He went to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred shrine in Greece, where the Pythia spoke Apollo's will. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus, confirm this consultation. The priestess listened to his confession, though the gods already knew, and after inhaling the prophetic vapors, gave her answer. There was a path to redemption, not easy, not quick, but possible. He must go to Mycenae, present himself to King Eurystheus, the man who'd stolen his birthright through Hera's trickery, and for 10 years, serve him as a bondsman, completing whatever tasks Eurystheus commanded, no matter how difficult, dangerous, or humiliating. Heracles accepted without hesitation. 10 years of servitude seemed a small price for the possibility of washing away the blood of his children. He traveled to Mycenae and presented himself not as the hero of Thebes, but as a supplicant seeking penance, explaining the oracle's command and offering his service. Eurystheus saw opportunity. Based on the tasks he subsequently assigned, which multiple sources confirm were suggested by Hera herself, scholarly analysis strongly suggests she proposed labors no mortal could complete, challenges designed to result in Heracles' death. Even if he somehow survived one, there would be another and another until he finally fell. The king originally commanded 10 labors, but Eurystheus, with Hera's guidance, would later refuse to count 2 completed tasks on technical grounds, requiring 2 additional labors. 10 became 12, and the 12 labors of Hercules became foundational to Western mythology. Heracles accepted. He had no choice. The oracle had spoken. His guilt was absolute. If these labors could purchase redemption, he'd complete them or die trying. And if he died, well, perhaps that too was redemption. He didn't know he'd face invincible lions and hydras whose heads multiplied. Didn't know he'd clean stables holding 30 years of divine cattle filth, chase sacred deer for a year without rest, or descend into death itself to capture its guardian. He knew only that he'd murdered his children and must do whatever necessary to atone. The labors began, and with them, a journey that would transform a broken man into something unprecedented, a mortal who, through impossible deeds alone, would earn divinity. But that apotheosis lay far ahead, beyond labors yet completed, beyond pain yet endured. First, there was a lion, and according to Hesiod, multiple later sources, and consistent artistic tradition, no weapon forged by mortals could kill it. Labor 1. The Nemean Lion. The hills around Nemea were dying. Entire families vanished in the night. Shepherds entered pastures and never returned. Travelers' screams echoed from valleys, but their bodies were never found. Roads that once connected towns lay empty. The marketplace stood silent. Terror on 4 legs was slowly strangling an entire region. The source was a lion, but not any lion nature had ever created. This was the Nemean Lion, and ancient sources disagree about its origins, which suggests the creature's legend predated unified Greek mythology. Hesiod's Theogony describes it as offspring of Typhon and Echidna, sibling to the Hydra and Chimera. Other traditions preserved by Hyginus and others suggest Selene, the moon goddess, placed it in Nemea at Hera's request. Still, others claim descent from the Chimera itself. Whatever its parentage, its nature was terrifyingly clear. The lion was massive. Some traditions claim twice the size of normal lions, with a golden coat that shimmered in sunlight and glowed faintly in darkness. But size didn't make it invincible. According to all major sources including Hesiod, Pindar, Apollodorus, Theocritus, and consistent artistic representations from the 6th century BCE onward, its hide was impervious to every weapon humans possessed. Arrows bounced off, swords shattered, spears were useless. Meanwhile, its claws could tear through armor and stone with equal ease. The beast laired in a cave on Mount Tratos, a name meaning perforated because of a distinctive cleft running through the mountain's base, as described by Diodorus Siculus. The cave had 2 entrances, making direct assault nearly impossible. A perfect fortress for a perfect killing machine. When Eurystheus presented this task, "Bring me the Nemean lion's skin," he could barely contain his satisfaction, preserved in narrative traditions. The clear expectation, this would be Heracles' death sentence, not a task with any genuine expectation of success. The hunt begins. Heracles set out from Mycenae with conventional weapons, a powerful bow, arrows, sword, and his massive olive wood club that he'd uprooted barehanded. He wore warrior's armor and carried confidence born from never meeting his match in combat. He didn't yet understand this labor would teach him the futility of conventional warfare and force him to trust his most essential nature, bare-handed strength. His journey took him first to Cleonae, on the road between Argos and Corinth, near Nemean territory. There he met Mallorcus, a poor day laborer. This detail appears in Apollodorus and Theocritus. Mallorcus had lost everything to the lion's predations. Flocks gone, livelihood destroyed, neighbors dead or fled. Yet when the famous Heracles appeared seeking information, Mallorcus offered hospitality without hesitation, preparing to sacrifice his only remaining possession. One ram, last remnant of what had been a thriving herd. Heracles, moved by this generosity from someone with so little, stopped him according to traditional accounts. "Wait 30 days. If I return victorious, we'll sacrifice this ram together to Zeus the Savior in thanksgiving. But if I don't return, if the lion defeats me, then sacrifice the ram to me as one offers to the honored dead." Mallorcus agreed. Heracles continued into Nemean hills, tracking the beast for days, following massive paw prints that sank deep into earth, each large enough to serve as a basin. The destruction it left was extraordinary. Trees scored by claw marks, boulders displaced, ground torn, and everywhere the bones of victims, human and animal, picked clean and scattered like terrible seeds. The futility of weapons. Finally, Heracles found the lion sprawled in afternoon sun outside its cave, gorged on a recent kill, drowsing in heat. For a moment he simply observed, recognizing the perfection of its predatory form, the casual deadliness in every line of its massive body. Then he raised his bow, drew the string back with force that could drive an arrow through oak, and fired. The arrow flew true, striking the lion directly in its flank with enough force to fell any mortal creature. The arrow bounced off harmlessly, clattering against stones, its bronze tip bent and useless. Multiple sources, including Theocritus, emphasize this moment, the futility of conventional weapons. The lion's eyes opened. It saw Heracles, and it seemed almost amused, bearing fangs the length of a man's fingers. Heracles fired again and again. He emptied his quiver, arrows he'd crafted specifically for this task, each perfectly balanced and fletched with care. He drove them at the lion with all his strength, targeting eyes, throat, any vulnerable point. Every arrow failed. Some bounced off. Others shattered on impact. The lion watched with what seemed like amusement, making no effort to flee or even rise. Understanding dawned. Conventional warfare was useless. This required a different approach. When the lion finally rose and began moving toward the cave, perhaps intending to sleep, perhaps simply bored, Heracles acted. He grabbed his club, the massive olive wood weapon that had never failed him, and brought it down on the lion's skull with force that could split boulders. Apollodorus and artistic traditions confirmed this detail. The impact made a sound like thunder. The lion staggered, momentarily stunned. The club shattered into splinters. The weapon that had served Heracles faithfully through countless battles was destroyed in one blow. But it had worked, briefly. The lion was dazed, but recovering. Heracles had seconds before it would be fully alert and absolutely enraged. He could hear the rational part of his mind cataloging options. Run, regroup, find another weapon, try something different tomorrow. But his instincts, the demigod nature he'd inherited from Zeus, told him this was his chance. The only chance. If he let this moment pass, the lion would never give him another. The bare-handed kill. So Heracles did what no sane human would attempt. He charged the stunned lion with his bare hands. What followed was one of the most famous scenes in all Greek mythology, depicted in countless artistic representations from the 6th century BCE onward. Heracles and the Nemean Lion locked in combat. The hero's arms wrapped around the beast, using his superhuman strength not to strike or cut, but simply to squeeze. According to Apollodorus and the visual tradition, Heracles pursued the lion into its cave. But he blocked one entrance first with massive boulders, forcing it to retreat to the cave's depths. There, in darkness where conventional sight meant nothing, where only strength and determination mattered, Heracles caught up with the beast. The lion fought with every weapon nature had given it: claws that scored his flesh, jaws that sought his throat, weight and muscle meant to crush. Heracles fought with the only weapon that mattered here: his arms. He got them around the lion's neck, one of the few places where the invulnerable hide offered a vulnerable target: airways that could be crushed, blood flow that could be stopped. He squeezed. The lion thrashed, trying to break free, to throw him off, to reach him with fangs or claws. Heracles held on. His muscles screamed. His lungs burned. Blood from the lion's claws ran down his arms. None of it mattered. He squeezed harder. The lion's movements grew weaker. Frantic thrashing became desperate twitching, then stillness, then nothing. Heracles held on long after the lion stopped moving, making certain. Only when he was absolutely sure did he release his grip, collapsing next to the massive corpse, gasping for breath, covered in his own blood, in the lion's saliva, hands cramping from the sustained pressure. He had killed the unkillable, strangled an invincible monster with nothing but his bare hands. And in doing so, proved something both to himself and to anyone watching from Olympus. Some problems can't be solved with weapons, with strategy, with anything except your own essential nature, whatever that might be. The impervious hide. But the labor wasn't complete. Eurystheus had demanded the lion's skin. Heracles needed to remove it, and quickly discovered a new problem. The hide that couldn't be penetrated by arrows, swords, or spears also couldn't be cut by any blade he possessed. Multiple sources preserve what happened next, though minor details vary. Based on the most common traditions and the logic of the situation, it appears Heracles tried every implement he carried, attempting to skin the beast with his sword, his knife, even the shattered fragments of his club. Nothing worked. The skin was utterly impervious. Then, either through divine inspiration, simple logic, or desperate experimentation, he realized something. If no external weapon could cut the hide, perhaps the hide itself could. The lion's own claws had been sharp enough to tear his flesh. Perhaps they could tear the lion's hide as well. According to Apollodorus and preserved traditions, Heracles used one of the lion's own claws to skin the beast, carefully working the hide free from the body beneath. It was painstaking, difficult work, but it succeeded. When he finished, he had what Eurystheus had demanded: the golden hide of the Nemean Lion, invulnerable armor that no weapon could pierce. He crafted it into a cloak, wearing the lion's pelt with its head serving as a helmet, its invulnerability now his protection. In artistic representations from the 6th century BCE onward, Heracles is almost always depicted wearing the Nemean lion's skin. It became his signature, his identity, visual proof of his first impossible labor. The return. When Heracles emerged from the cave carrying the lion's body and wearing its hide, he returned first to Mallorcus. It was the 30th day, exactly as he'd promised. The poor laborer was preparing to sacrifice his ram to Heracles, as to the honored dead, believing the hero must have fallen. Instead, Heracles arrived victorious. Together, as promised, they sacrificed the ram to Zeus the Savior, thanking the god for Heracles' survival and success. From there, Heracles traveled to Mycenae with his impossible trophy. When he arrived at Eurystheus' palace, multiple sources including Apollodorus and artistic traditions preserve what happened. The king took one look at Heracles approaching with the massive lion carcass, saw the blood-soaked hero wearing the creature's skin and panicked. He fled into a large bronze jar, a pithos, a storage container that he kept for precisely this purpose, hiding inside while guards confirmed the labor's completion from a safe distance. This image, Heracles standing outside with his trophy, while Eurystheus cowers in his jar, became a recurring motif in ancient art, appearing on vases and sculptures throughout the classical period. It establishes a pattern that would repeat. Heracles succeeding at impossible tasks, while his supposed master trembled in fear of the very man he commanded. From that moment forward, Eurystheus refused to let Heracles enter the city walls. Instead, whenever the hero returned from a labor, he had to display his proof outside the gates, while Eurystheus, usually from the safety of his jar, confirmed the task's completion from a distance. One labor complete. 9 more commanded, though eventually 12 would be required. Heracles had proven he could kill the unkillable, could survive what should be fatal, could accomplish what all others considered impossible. But success didn't bring peace. It brought only the next task, the next monster, the next journey to the edge of human endurance and beyond. The blood on his hands from his children's deaths remained unwashed. The weight of guilt hadn't lightened. Redemption, if it existed at all, lay somewhere beyond the next labor, and the next, and the next, always just out of reach, always requiring one more impossible deed, one more test of endurance. The path to atonement was longer than he'd imagined, and it had only just begun. Labor 2, the Lernaean Hydra. The swamps around Lerna stank of rot and poison. Ancient sources including Hesiod's Theogony, Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, and Pausanias' Description of Greece describe this region in grim detail. A place where mist rose from stagnant water, where twisted trees grew in unnatural shapes, where nothing wholesome lived, and local residents spoke in whispers of the thing that dwelt in the darkness at the swamp's heart. The Lernaean Hydra was born of Typhon and Echidna, according to Hesiod, the same monstrous parentage as the Nemean Lion, making them siblings in monstrosity. But where the lion was a predator that could be understood in natural terms, the Hydra was something else. A serpent of impossible proportions with multiple heads. Sources vary from 7 to 9 to more, and the ability that made it truly nightmarish: immortality through regeneration. Cut off one head, and 2 would grow in its place. This wasn't legend or exaggeration for effect. Multiple independent ancient sources, including Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and Euripides, confirm this regenerative power as the central challenge of the Hydra labor. The creature's breath was poisonous according to consistent testimony, toxic enough to kill anyone who inhaled it. Its blood was even worse, a venom so potent that even a scratch was fatal, with no cure and no hope of survival. The Hydra had been terrorizing the region of Lerna for years, emerging from its swamp lair to prey on livestock and anyone foolish enough to venture too close. Farmers had abandoned their fields. Travelers avoided the entire area. The Hydra's domain was expanding as its reputation grew, and no one had found a way to stop it. The challenge of regeneration Eurystheus's command was straightforward: kill the Lernaean Hydra. But the simplicity of the order belied its impossibility. How do you kill something that grows stronger each time you wound it? How do you fight a creature whose every severed head spawns two more, whose breath alone is fatal, whose blood kills on contact? Based on scholarly analysis of the myth's structure and Heracles' approach, it seems reasonable to infer that he initially assumed this would be similar to the Nemean Lion, a straightforward test of strength and courage against a dangerous creature. He didn't yet understand that some problems become worse when you attack them directly, that sometimes the obvious solution creates more problems than it solves. Heracles traveled to Lerna with his nephew Iolaus, son of his brother Iphicles. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus, confirm Iolaus's presence. This detail would later become crucial for both the labor's success and Eurystheus's refusal to count it as fulfilled. They found the Hydra in its lair near the springs of Amamone, a dark pool where the monster coiled, its multiple heads weaving patterns in the fetid air. According to Apollodorus and consistent tradition, Heracles tried to force the Hydra from its lair by shooting flaming arrows into the entrance, using fire to drive the beast into the open where he could fight it. The tactic worked. The Hydra emerged, its heads hissing and striking, venom dripping from fangs, each head moving independently to attack from different angles. Heracles charged, club in hand. He'd fashioned a new one after destroying the original on the Nemean Lion, and began striking at the serpentine heads, trying to beat them down or sever them from the main body. Each time his club connected, crushing a skull or severing a head, he achieved momentary success. That head would fall, would seem defeated, and then, before his eyes, two new heads would sprout from the stump, growing with horrifying speed until fully formed, hissing and striking just like the original. He was making it stronger. Every successful attack spawned more heads, multiplied his opponents, turned his victories into defeats. This pattern appears consistently in ancient sources and seems to have been the core challenge of the myth. Recognizing that the instinctive response, strike harder, cut more heads, was precisely what made the situation impossible. The crab's intervention. As if fighting a multiplying serpent with poisonous breath and fatal blood wasn't challenge enough, Hera, still orchestrating Heracles' destruction, sent additional help for the Hydra. According to Apollodorus and other sources, a giant crab emerged from the swamp and attacked Heracles, biting his foot while he fought the Hydra, trying to distract or cripple him at the crucial moment when he needed all his concentration. Heracles, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, managed to crush the crab beneath his foot, killing it quickly. The crab had failed its mission, but Hera honored its sacrifice. According to tradition, preserved by multiple sources, she placed the crab among the stars as the constellation Cancer, ensuring that this servant who died trying to kill Heracles would be remembered forever in the night sky. But even with the crab dead, Heracles was losing. The Hydra now had dozens of heads, all striking at him simultaneously, and his attempts to fight back only made matters worse. The swamp was filling with severed heads, and the new heads growing from them, creating a forest of fanged serpents, all trying to bite him, all dripping fatal venom. Fire, the solution. This is where Iolaus proved crucial. According to Apollodorus and the established tradition, Iolaus watched the battle, saw the pattern, understood the problem, and devised the solution. The heads were regrowing because the stumps were still alive, still capable of regeneration. But what if the stumps were cauterized immediately after severing, burned so thoroughly that no life remained to spawn new growth? Iolaus gathered wood from the dying trees around the swamp and built a large fire. Then he prepared torches. Multiple sources describe him using firebrands or branches set ablaze, and waited for his moment. Heracles, understanding what his nephew intended, adapted his strategy. They worked in coordination. Heracles would strike with his sword, severing a head. Immediately before new heads could sprout, Iolaus would rush forward with his torch and cauterize the stump, burning it thoroughly, preventing regeneration. Head by head, they worked through the Hydra, Heracles cutting, Iolaus burning. The process was dangerous, exhausting, required perfect timing. Miss even slightly, and new heads would sprout before the fire could reach the stump. But they didn't miss. Slowly, methodically, they reduced the Hydra from a multi-headed nightmare to something manageable. Finally, only one head remained. But this head was different. According to Apollodorus and preserved tradition, this central head was immortal, truly unkillable, not through regeneration, but through fundamental immortality. When Heracles severed it, no new heads grew, but the head itself remained alive, hissing and biting, even detached from the body, its immortal nature making death impossible. Heracles' solution, preserved in multiple sources, was practical and final. He buried the immortal head deep in the earth, rolling a massive boulder over it to trap it forever. Couldn't be killed? Then make it irrelevant, entomb it where it could never harm anyone again. The Hydra's body finally died. The labor was complete, except for one final, crucial detail. The poisoned arrows. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus, Sophocles' Trachiniae, and numerous other references, preserve what Heracles did next. And this detail would echo through the rest of his story and beyond his own death. The Hydra's blood was the deadliest poison known to Greek mythology, fatal on contact, incurable, capable of killing even demigods. Most people would have feared this blood, avoided it, treated it as the dangerous substance it was. Heracles saw opportunity. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, coating each tip with the fatal venom. From this point forward in the labors, whenever he used his bow, he wielded arrows that could not be survived, that killed with the slightest scratch, that turned every shot into certain death for his target. This would prove useful in future labors, but it would also bring tragedy. The Hydra's venom, preserved on Heracles' arrows, would eventually kill friends by accident, would be used by enemies for revenge, and would, years after the labors ended, cause Heracles' own death when his wife Deianira, trying to keep his love, gave him a robe soaked in what she thought was a love potion, but was actually Hydra venom mixed with the blood of the centaur Nessus, whom Heracles had shot years before with one of these same poisoned arrows. But that tragedy lay in the future, for now Heracles had venom-tipped arrows that made him deadlier than any mortal archer, and a victory against a creature that should have been unbeatable. Eurystheus' betrayal. When Heracles returned to Mycenae and reported the Hydra's death, Eurystheus examined the circumstances according to multiple ancient sources. Then he made a decision that would extend the labors beyond their original scope. He refused to count this task as fulfilled. His reasoning, preserved in Apollodorus and other accounts, Iolaus had helped. The labor was supposed to test Heracles alone, prove his individual prowess, force him to survive impossible challenges through his own strength and cunning. By accepting his nephew's assistance, even though without that help, the Hydra would have been literally impossible to defeat, Heracles had violated the spirit of the task. The labor didn't count. He'd have to complete an additional task to make up for this failure. This refusal reveals something important about the labor's true nature. They weren't genuine tests of heroism or opportunities for redemption. They were, as scholarly analysis has long recognized, designed to be impossible, meant to kill Heracles, or at least to trap him in endless servitude. Every completion would be questioned, every success dismissed on technicalities, the goalposts constantly moving to ensure that redemption remained forever out of reach. Heracles had no choice but to accept this judgment. The oracle had commanded service to Eurystheus. Defying the king meant defying the oracle, abandoning his only path to atonement. 2 labors completed by anyone's honest count, but only one acknowledged. The path to redemption had just gotten longer, and the next task would test not his strength or cunning, but something different entirely: patience, endurance, and the ability to survive an impossible pursuit that would last an entire year without rest. Labor 3. The Ceryneian Hind. The third labor moved from swamps and serpents to the high forests of Arcadia, from killing monsters to capturing something sacred. Eurystheus, advised by Hera, and recorded in multiple ancient sources, including Apollodorus and Euripides, commanded Heracles to capture the Ceryneian Hind and bring it back to Mycenae, alive and unharmed. This task was designed with particular cruelty. The hind, a female deer, was no monster. According to consistent tradition preserved by Callimachus, Apollodorus, and others, it was one of 5 hinds that the goddess Artemis herself had encountered when she was still a child. 4 of them she'd harnessed to draw her chariot. The 5th had escaped into the wild, running free across Arcadia, sacred to the goddess of the hunt. This deer was extraordinary in every way the ancient sources describe. Larger than any natural doe, with golden antlers, despite being female, which multiple sources note as unusual, bronze hooves that rang like bells when striking stone, and speed that outpaced any mortal creature. Pindar and other poets describe it as moving faster than arrows in flight, crossing mountains and valleys without tiring, as much a manifestation of wild freedom as an actual animal. Most importantly for Heracles' dilemma, it was sacred to Artemis, the goddess who had appeared to Heracles before, who had let him capture the sacred hind only with strict promises, who was notoriously protective of her sacred animals and notoriously unforgiving of those who harmed them. Ancient mythology is filled with cautionary tales about Artemis's vengeance. Actaeon transformed into a stag and killed by his own dogs for accidentally glimpsing her bathing. Entire cities punished for minor offenses against her worship. Hunters who killed her sacred animals suffering terrible fates. To harm a creature sacred to Artemis invited divine retribution. But Eurystheus had commanded capture, and to fail meant abandoning redemption. Heracles was trapped between divine prohibition and mortal duty, with no clear path that didn't risk catastrophe. The year-long chase. Heracles began by trying to catch the hind through speed and strength, the same qualities that had served him in previous labors. But the creature was faster than anything he'd ever pursued. It outpaced his running, according to consistent testimony. It crossed terrain that would have broken his ankles. It seemed to anticipate every trap, every ambush, every attempt at interception. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus and Pindar, confirm that Heracles pursued the hind for an entire year, following it across Arcadia, across the wild places where gods still walked, tracking it by bronze hoofprints on stones and golden antler glints catching sunlight in the distance. Some sources, including Pindar, claim the chase carried him into Hyperborea, the legendary land beyond the north wind, where eternal spring reigned and the sun never set. Others speak of him following it through all of Greece and beyond, into territories where mortals rarely ventured. The chase became its own kind of labor, testing not strength but endurance, not cunning but patience. The seasons cycled. Heracles grew lean and hard from constant movement, living rough in wilderness, sleeping rarely, eating what he could catch or forage, always keeping the hind in sight, always pressing the pursuit. This detail of the year-long duration appears consistently across ancient sources, suggesting it was well established in the original tradition. His mind achieved a kind of meditative state, focused entirely on the chase, on the rhythm of pursuit that became almost ceremonial. The capture and divine confrontation. Finally, after 12 full months, according to Apollodorus, he managed to corner it. The hind had stopped to drink from a stream, pausing for the first time in a year, and Heracles, moving with the quiet precision of a lifetime spent hunting, approached close enough to act. Different ancient sources give different accounts of exactly how he captured it, which suggests the evidence allows for multiple interpretations. Apollodorus suggests he shot it with an arrow, careful to strike only the legs, causing no permanent harm, but slowing it enough to capture. Other traditions preserved by later authors claim he simply grabbed it during a moment of mutual exhaustion when neither could run any farther. However he managed it, Heracles found himself holding the sacred hind, and in that moment, Artemis appeared. Multiple sources, including Callimachus and references in Euripides, describe this confrontation. The goddess of the hunt manifested before him in all her divine glory. Silver bright and cold as moonlight, her bow drawn, an arrow nocked and pointed directly at his heart. Her expression promised death, and her reputation suggested she wouldn't hesitate. "You dare," she said, and the words were not a question but an accusation, "to capture what is mine?" Heracles, thinking quickly despite his exhaustion, set the hind down gently, according to the traditional account. He demonstrated proper respect in the formulaic manner of Greek religious discourse. "I dare nothing, great Artemis, except to obey the oracle of Delphi. I am bound by sacred decree to complete the labors set by Eurystheus. I mean no disrespect to you or to your sacred animal. I will return this hind to your care immediately after presenting it to Eurystheus as proof of completion. It will not be harmed. It will not be held captive. It is yours, and it will remain yours. Artemis regarded him silently. The arrow remained pointed at his chest. But something in his words, in his obvious reverence for the divine order, in his genuine regret at having to disturb her property, made her pause. She knew of his labors. She knew of the madness that had driven him to them. She knew, perhaps better than most, what it meant to be trapped between impossible choices. If you harm it, she said finally, lowering her bow according to preserved tradition, if you fail to release it after your task is complete, I will hunt you as you have hunted this hind, and the pursuit will end only with your death. I understand, Heracles said according to the account, and I give you my oath that the hind will return to you unharmed. The goddess vanished. Heracles was left holding the sacred animal, which had gone still and calm in his arms, as if understanding that the immediate danger had passed. The return and release. He carried it back across all the territory he'd traversed during the year-long chase, returning to Mycenae with his burden. When he arrived, Eurystheus emerged from his hiding jar just long enough to verify the labor's completion, but then demanded that Heracles release the hind inside the palace grounds, claiming he wanted to examine it more closely. This put Heracles in an impossible position. If he released the hind within the walls, Eurystheus could claim ownership, could keep it captive, would certainly violate Heracles' oath to Artemis. The goddess would hold Heracles responsible for the broken promise, regardless of who actually caused the violation. But Heracles, according to Apollodorus and the tradition, had learned something during his first 3 labors about navigating divine politics and technicalities. He refused Eurystheus's demand. Instead, in a calculated move that showed his growing sophistication, he set the hind down gently just outside the palace gates and stepped back. The moment its hooves touched the ground, it leaped away, racing back toward Arcadia with speed that left only golden afterimages in the air. By the time Eurystheus's guards could react, it was gone. Returned to the wild places where it belonged, oath fulfilled, goddess satisfied. Eurystheus, frustrated but unable to argue with the technical completion of the labor, had to accept it. 3 labors complete by honest count, or 2 if you didn't count the Hydra. But the king and his divine patron were already planning the 4th task, and this one would require not speed or patience, but the ability to capture one of the most dangerous creatures in Greece without killing it. Because sometimes Eurystheus was learning keeping something alive was harder than killing it. And perhaps harder still was watching Heracles succeed again and again at tasks designed to be fatal. Watching this man refuse to die no matter how impossible the challenges became. The pattern was becoming clear. Heracles would succeed. The question was no longer whether he could complete the labors, but what price would be paid along the way, and whose lives would be disrupted or destroyed as side effects of his quest for redemption that seemed to stretch longer with every victory. Labor 4, the Erymanthian Boar. The fourth labor tested something different in Heracles, something perhaps more challenging than facing monsters that wanted to kill him. According to Apollodorus and consistent tradition, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles capture the Erymanthian Boar and bring it back alive. Not killed, not defeated at a distance. Captured, bound, and delivered to Mycenae, still breathing, still dangerous, still capable of goring a man, with tusks the size of swords. The Erymanthian Boar was a creature of legend even among legendary creatures. Multiple ancient sources, including Apollodorus, Seneca, Statius, and Diodorus Siculus, describe it dwelling on Mount Erymanthus in the wild highlands of Arcadia, that same mountainous region where Heracles had chased the Ceryneian Hind. The boar was enormous, far larger than any natural pig, with bristling hair like iron needles, foaming jaws that never seemed to close, and tusks that could uproot full-grown trees. It descended from the mountain periodically to ravage the farmlands of Sophis, destroying crops, killing livestock, and goring to death any farmer or shepherd brave or foolish enough to try to stop it. The beast represented untamed nature at its most destructive, the wild places pushing back against human civilization, reminding mortals that no matter how many cities they built or fields they planted, there were still forces that could not be tamed by ordinary means. Some traditions suggest it was sacred to Artemis like the hind, though whether this protection extended to the boar or whether the goddess would overlook its capture is never clearly stated in surviving sources. Based on the consistent pattern of Eurystheus's task selection throughout the labors, it seems reasonable to infer that he specifically chose this challenge because it combined multiple difficulties: the physical danger of capturing something so large and dangerous, the practical problem of transporting it alive across mountainous terrain, and the potential divine complication if Artemis took offense. The Centaur tragedy. Heracles set out for Mount Erymanthus, following the trails up into the high country, where shepherds rarely ventured anymore, past abandoned farms and fields gone to wilderness. The journey took him through Pholoe, a forested mountain region, where he stopped to visit an old friend, a civilized centaur named Pholus. This encounter, while seemingly a brief interlude, would have profound and tragic consequences, demonstrating yet again how death followed Heracles even when he meant no harm. Pholus, unlike his wilder kin, lived peacefully in a cave on the mountain, cooking his meat and observing the customs of hospitality that Greeks considered sacred. According to Apollodorus and other sources, when Heracles arrived, Pholus welcomed him warmly, prepared a meal, and the two friends sat together as night fell. Heracles, thirsty from his journey, asked for wine. Pholus hesitated. He possessed only one jar of wine, and it wasn't his alone to share. This wine was a communal gift from Dionysus, intended for all the centaurs of the region. To open it for a single guest would violate the unspoken agreement among the centaurs. But Heracles was persuasive, and Pholus eventually relented. The moment he unsealed the jar, its rich aroma spread through the mountain air, carried on the evening breeze to every cave and den where centaurs dwelt. And the centaurs came, drawn by the scent, arriving at Pholus's cave in growing numbers, their faces twisted with rage at what they perceived as theft of their common property. The centaurs who gathered outside weren't civilized like their host. They were wild creatures, half human and half horse, given to violence and excess. They hadn't learned that wine must be tempered with water, or it drives even rational beings to madness. They burst into the cave, attacking Heracles, throwing rocks and wielding clubs torn from trees, intent on punishing this theft. Heracles had no choice but to defend himself. Multiple sources describe the battle that followed. He seized burning brands from the fire, driving the attackers back with flame. When they regrouped outside, he took up his bow, arrows still tipped with the Hydra's poison from his second labor, and began to shoot. Each arrow that struck meant certain death, the venom working instantly, dropping centaurs where they stood, or sending them fleeing in agony into the night. The battle was chaos and tragedy. According to Apollodorus and preserved tradition, many centaurs died, including Elatus, who was struck by a poisoned arrow. The survivors scattered into the wilderness, some fleeing as far as Cape Malea, at the southern tip of Greece, others taking refuge in the sanctuary of Eleusis, where Poseidon hid them within a mountain. Even the great centaur Chiron, wisest of his kind and teacher to many heroes including Heracles himself, was accidentally struck by one of the poisoned arrows when he came to investigate the commotion. Chiron was immortal, so the poison couldn't kill him, but it condemned him to eternal agony, a wound that would never heal, pain that would never end. This suffering was so unbearable that Chiron would eventually beg to give up his immortality, to be allowed to die and escape the torment, though that moment lay years in the future, and his eventual release would come when he agreed to take Prometheus's place, allowing the Titan to be freed. Pholus' death, the most heartbreaking tragedy, came last. Pholus, mourning his fallen kindred, tried to bury the dead with honor. He picked up one of the poisoned arrows from a corpse, marveling, according to Apollodorus, that something so small could kill creatures so large and powerful. In his wonder and grief, his hands trembled. The arrow slipped, its tip scratching his foot, barely breaking the skin. It was enough. The Hydra's venom, which could not be cured or survived, worked instantly. Pholus fell dead, killed by hospitality, killed by friendship, killed by the very arrows that were meant to help Heracles complete his labors. When Heracles returned from chasing off the surviving centaurs, he found his friend dead. Apollodorus records that he buried Pholus with all the honor he could, raising a burial mound on the mountain that would bear the centaur's name forever after. Another friend lost, another death that could be traced, however indirectly, to Heracles' presence, to the curse of violence that seemed to follow him, no matter how peaceful his intentions. The capture. But the labor still waited. Heracles continued up Mount Erymanthus, following the tracks and signs of the great boar, listening for its distinctive grunting and rooting. He found it in a dense thicket, a shadow of tusks and bristles and rage. The question was how to capture it without killing it, how to subdue something so large and dangerous that it could easily gore him to death if he made a mistake. Different sources offer slightly different accounts of how Heracles accomplished this feat, which suggests the evidence allows for more than one interpretation. According to Apollodorus's most detailed account, Heracles drove the boar from its thicket by shouting, chasing it up the mountainside into the deep winter snows, that lay perpetually on Erymanthus's highest peaks. The boar, exhausted by running through snow that sometimes reached above its head, moving through drifts that offered no firm footing, finally weakened. When it could run no farther, when its legs trembled with exhaustion and its breath came in ragged gasps, Heracles was able to throw his net over it, binding it securely before it could recover enough to fight. Other traditions preserved by different authors suggest he may have used a different strategy, perhaps cornering it in a narrow ravine, or using his club to stun it temporarily. But most accounts agree on the crucial detail. He managed to capture it alive, to bind it in chains strong enough to hold even that massive beast, and to lift it onto his shoulders for the long journey back to Mycenae. The image of Heracles carrying the enormous, still-living boar across his shoulders became one of the most popular representations of this labor in ancient art, depicted on countless vases and sculptures from the 6th century BCE onward, showing the hero's massive frame bent under the weight, but still moving, still carrying his impossible burden. The return. The journey back was torment. The boar, though bound, thrashed and struggled. Its tusks slashed at Heracles. Its weight threatened to break even his superhuman strength. Ancient artistic representations often show blood running down Heracles' back, where the boar's tusks had managed to reach him. The wounds weren't fatal, but they were painful. Constant reminders that the creature he carried wanted nothing more than to kill him if it could break free. When Heracles finally arrived at the palace in Mycenae and called out to announce his success, Eurystheus once again fled in terror. This scene became almost comic in its repetition across various labors, a running motif in ancient depictions of these myths. The king, seeing Heracles approaching with the massive, snarling, thrashing boar on his shoulders, gave a cry of fear and dove into his storage jar, that same bronze pithos that had become his refuge. His hands raised in supplication or terror, his mouth open in a scream. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus and extensive artistic evidence, confirm this recurring image. Heracles, with what one suspects was a certain grim satisfaction, held the boar above the opening of the jar, letting Eurystheus see exactly what he had commanded be brought back alive. The king, trembling at the bottom of his hiding place, could barely speak, but he managed to confirm that, yes, the labor was complete, and Heracles could dispose of the beast however he wished. What happened to the Erymanthian boar after this moment is not recorded in surviving sources. The silence about the boar's ultimate fate suggests this detail was either not considered important by ancient storytellers or perhaps varied between different regional versions of the myth. 4 labors complete now, though Eurystheus still refused to count the Hydra. Heracles had killed 2 monsters, captured 2 dangerous creatures alive, and along the way had caused the deaths of many centaurs, including a friend. The pattern was becoming clear. Success in the labors didn't mean avoiding tragedy. Every victory came with a cost, and those costs were often paid by others who had the misfortune to be near Heracles when violence erupted, as it always eventually did. Labor 5. The Augean Stables. The 5th labor would be different from all that had come before, and in its difference lay a particular kind of humiliation that Eurystheus must have savored when he conceived it. There would be no monster to fight, no beast to hunt, no display of strength or courage that poets could celebrate in song. Instead, according to multiple sources including Apollodorus and references in Pindar and other poets, Heracles would be given a task that was, quite literally, the dirtiest job imaginable. King Augeas of Elis, according to various ancient traditions, possessed the largest herds of cattle in all of Greece. Apollodorus specifies that he had many herds, while some traditions claim 3,000 cattle, a number that may be symbolic rather than literal, but conveys the immense scale. These weren't ordinary cattle, but divine animals, blessed by the gods with exceptional fertility and health, animals that never grew sick and never stopped reproducing. They were sacred, touched by divine power, and their very presence was a sign of Augeas's wealth and divine favor. But there was a problem. The cattle lived in stables and pens that, according to consistent tradition, had not been cleaned in 30 years. Some sources say even longer. The accumulation of manure was beyond comprehension. Mountains of dung that had piled higher and higher, spreading disease, contaminating the land, creating a stench that could be smelled for miles. The valleys of Elis, which should have been verdant and productive, were instead buried under layers of filth. The rivers that should have provided clean water, instead carrying waste to the sea. It was an environmental disaster, a catastrophe born of neglect, and no one had been able to solve it because the cattle were divine, immortal, and could never stop producing more waste. To clean the stables would require removing decades of accumulated manure, an impossible task even for a large workforce with unlimited time. For one man to clean them in a single day, which was Eurystheus's command according to all sources, seemed beyond even the realm of possibility. The humiliation and the deal. The labor was designed to be both impossible and degrading. Heroes fought monsters, rescued maidens, retrieved legendary treasures. They didn't shovel manure. By assigning this task, Eurystheus was attempting to humiliate Heracles, to reduce the greatest hero of his generation to the status of a common laborer, to make him literally wallow in filth as penance for his crimes. It was meant to be a punishment that broke not his body, but his spirit, that made him an object of mockery rather than admiration. But Heracles understood something that Eurystheus hadn't anticipated. Based on his subsequent actions as recorded in multiple sources, it appears he recognized that the labor wasn't about strength or endurance. It was about engineering, about thinking differently, about using the landscape itself as a tool. Before beginning the task, Heracles went to King Augeas. This is where the evidence becomes slightly complicated, as different ancient sources provide varying accounts of what happened next. According to Apollodorus, and confirmed by other traditions, Heracles proposed a deal to Augeas without revealing that he was acting under orders from Eurystheus. He would clean the entire stable complex in a single day, Heracles promised, if Augeas would pay him 1/10 of his cattle as compensation. Augeas, believing the task impossible and that he was making a safe bet, agreed readily. The contract was witnessed, made binding in the presence of Augeas's son, Phyleus, who would later play a crucial role in what followed. The king likely expected Heracles to exhaust himself in the attempt and fail, perhaps even to become so filthy and defeated that he would simply leave in shame, abandoning the effort. The engineering solution. Heracles surveyed the problem with the eye of an engineer rather than a laborer. The stables were located in a valley, and two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed nearby, their courses running close to, but not through the contaminated areas. If those rivers could be redirected, if their combined force could be channeled directly through the stables, the sheer volume and power of the water would do in hours what manual labor couldn't accomplish in months. According to Apollodorus and the established tradition, he began to work, not with a shovel, but with his strength applied to engineering. At the foundation of the stable complex, he broke through the wall, creating a large opening. Then he went to the rivers, both of them, and began the monumental task of altering their courses. He dug channels, broke through barriers of earth and stone, created new paths for the water to follow. When he finally opened the channels he had created, both rivers began to pour through the stables. The force of the combined waters was tremendous, a roaring torrent that swept through the buildings, carrying away 30 years of accumulated filth in a matter of hours. The manure, the contaminated straw, the layers of waste that had seemed permanent, all of it was washed downstream, carried away to the sea. The water scoured the floors and walls clean, leaving behind stables that gleamed in the sunlight, ready to house the divine cattle in proper conditions for the first time in a generation. By evening, the task was complete. The rivers had done the work that no amount of human labor could have accomplished. Heracles redirected them back to their original courses, and the valleys of Elis were clean, the land able to recover, the air no longer thick with the stench of decay. The betrayal and its consequences. But when Heracles returned to Augeas to claim his payment, 1/10 of the cattle as agreed, the king refused to honor the contract. According to Apollodorus, Augeas had learned that Heracles was under orders from Eurystheus to complete this task, regardless of payment. The king argued, with the kind of logic that powerful men use to avoid keeping promises to their inferiors, that since Heracles was obligated to perform the labor anyway, he deserved no additional compensation. The bet was void, the contract meaningless, and Heracles could claim nothing. Heracles demanded justice according to multiple sources, bringing the matter before arbitrators to decide the case according to law. His witness was Phileus, Augeas's own son, who had been present when the agreement was made, and who testified truthfully that his father had indeed promised payment. But Augeas, enraged at his son's betrayal, banished both Heracles and Phileus from Elis before the court could render a verdict. Using his kingly power to avoid the judgment that would surely have gone against him. This injustice would fester in Heracles for years. Ancient sources record that later, after his labors were complete, Heracles would return to Elis at the head of an army, would make war upon Augeas, would kill the king, and give his kingdom to Phileus, the son who had chosen honesty over family loyalty, justice over personal advantage. But that revenge lay in the future, years away, and did nothing to ease the immediate frustration of being cheated. Eurystheus's refusal. When Heracles returned to Mycenae and reported his success to Eurystheus, the king refused to count this labor as fulfilled. His reasoning, preserved in ancient accounts, was that Heracles had sought payment for the work, which meant it wasn't done solely as penance, but partly for profit. The labor couldn't count toward his redemption if he had tried to benefit from it. This was a technicality, perhaps an unfair one, but Eurystheus had the power to enforce his interpretation, and there was nothing Heracles could do about it. Some manuscript traditions and sources vary on which labors were rejected. In some versions, it's the Augean Stables and the Hydra. In others, the Stymphalian Birds is rejected instead of the stables. What remains consistent is that Eurystheus refused to count 2 of the completed labors, meaning Heracles would eventually have to complete 12 tasks to fulfill what was originally supposed to be 10. 4 labors now, by Eurystheus's count, though Heracles had completed 5 tasks. The goalposts kept moving, the requirements kept changing, and the path to redemption seemed to stretch longer with each success. But Heracles had learned something important from this labor. Not everything could be solved with strength or courage. Sometimes wisdom was required, the ability to see problems differently, to use the world itself as a tool. It was a lesson he would need to remember in the trials ahead. Labor 6. The Stymphalian Birds. The 6th labor brought Heracles to the Stymphalian Lake in Arcadia, a place that had become a sanctuary for thousands of birds and a nightmare for everyone living nearby. According to multiple sources including Apollodorus, Pausanias, Diodorus Siculus, and references in various poets, these weren't ordinary birds. The Stymphalian birds were something far more dangerous. Multiple sources describe these birds as being numerous beyond counting, flocking to the lake in such numbers that they darkened the sky when they flew. Different traditions offer varying details about their nature. This variation itself appears to reflect different stages of the myth's development. Some accounts, particularly later ones, describe them with bronze beaks capable of piercing armor and metallic feathers they could launch like arrows, turning them into living weapons. Earlier sources, including the version in Apollodorus, present them more simply as birds whose droppings were poisonous and whose sheer numbers destroyed the local ecology, preventing crops from growing, fouling the water, making life unbearable for anyone trying to survive in the region. Pausanias adds an interesting detail, suggesting that the birds had originally come from somewhere else, perhaps driven by wolves or some other threat, seeking refuge in the thick forests around the lake, where predators couldn't easily reach them. Based on this testimony and the broader pattern of Heracles' labors, it seems reasonable to infer that the birds themselves may not have been inherently evil, but were simply overwhelming in their numbers. A natural imbalance that had gotten so out of control that heroic intervention became necessary to restore order. The challenge of access. The challenge of this labor wasn't combat in the traditional sense, but strategy. The birds nested in the thick woods surrounding the lake, where the marshy ground wouldn't support Heracles' weight. He couldn't simply wade in and fight them one by one. He couldn't burn the forest without committing a sacrilege against the land. He needed a way to drive them out into the open where his arrows could reach them, where his strength would matter. According to Apollodorus, Heracles stood at the edge of the marsh for some time, puzzling over the problem, trying to devise a solution. It was then that Athena appeared to him, the goddess who had been his patron from before his birth, who had helped him in previous labors. She carried bronze castanets, or rattles called krotala in Greek, instruments that Hephaestus, the divine smith, had forged specifically for this purpose. The metal of the rattles had been crafted to produce a particular sound, a noise so piercing and terrible that no creature could bear to hear it. Athena instructed Heracles to climb to the mountain that overlooked the lake and to shake the rattles with all his strength. The sound, she promised, would drive the birds from their sanctuary in the woods, would force them into the air where they could be dealt with. The solution: Heracles followed these instructions. From the mountainside, he began to clash the bronze instruments together, creating a cacophony that echoed across the water and into the trees. The sound wasn't music, but something far more unsettling, a metallic screeching that seemed designed to inspire panic in any creature that heard it. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The birds erupted from the forest by the thousands, rising into the air in a vast cloud that filled the sky. Their wings beat frantically, their cries of alarm adding to the chaos of noise. They circled above the lake in confusion, unable to return to their nests, with that terrible sound still echoing from the mountain, unable to find peace or safety anywhere nearby. What happened next varies slightly between ancient sources, reflecting either different traditions or different aspects of the same event. According to Apollodorus, Heracles shot many of the birds with his arrows as they flew overhead, his bow singing its own deadly music as arrow after arrow found targets in the panicked flock. His arrows were still tipped with the Hydra's poison, so each shot that connected meant a bird falling from the sky, dying before it hit the ground or water. The ancient accounts suggest he killed a significant number, though not all of them. Some traditions preserved by different authors, including Pausanias and references in Apollonius Rhodius, claim that the majority of the birds simply fled, driven away by the terrible noise, flying far from Stymphalus and never returning, seeking new habitats where they wouldn't be disturbed. These surviving birds, according to sources that trace their fate, eventually settled on the island of Aretias in the Euxine Sea, the Black Sea, where they would later be encountered by the Argonauts during their quest for the Golden Fleece. Other accounts preserved in later sources suggest Heracles killed them all, that no bird survived his assault, that the sky rained dead birds until the problem was entirely eliminated. The variation in these accounts makes it difficult to be certain about the exact outcome. But what all sources agree on is that the region around Lake Stymphalus was freed from the plague of birds, that the land could recover, that people could return to farming and fishing and living without fear. The labor's acceptance or rejection. Heracles brought some of the slain birds back to Eurystheus as proof of his success. The king, emerging from his storage jar just long enough to verify the labor's completion, had to accept that the task was done. However, ancient sources record that there was controversy about this labor as well. Different manuscript traditions of Apollodorus and other authors show variation on this point. In some versions, it's the Augean Stables that are discounted for impropriety, while the Stymphalian Birds are accepted. In other versions, the reverse is true. The birds are rejected because Athena helped by providing the rattles, while the stables are accepted. What remains consistent across all traditions is that Eurystheus refused to count 2 of the labors, which meant Heracles would eventually have to complete 12 tasks to fulfill what was originally supposed to be 10, a moving target that must have felt increasingly like divine mockery. The 6 Peloponnesian labors were now complete, every task set in the lands close to Mycenae, in the regions that Heracles knew. But Eurystheus, seeing that proximity and familiarity hadn't defeated the hero, would now send him farther afield, to distant lands, to the edges of the known world, to places where even heroes rarely return from, hoping that distance and foreignness would finally accomplish what monsters and impossible tasks had failed to achieve. Labor 7. The Cretan Bull. For the 7th labor, Heracles would have to leave the Peloponnese entirely, venturing across the sea to the great island of Crete, that cradle of ancient civilization where King Minos ruled, and where legends walked openly in daylight. According to multiple sources including Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and references in Euripides, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles capture the Cretan bull and bring it back to Mycenae alive, continuing the pattern of capture rather than kill that had proven so challenging in previous labors. The Cretan bull was no ordinary animal. According to various ancient traditions preserved by Apollodorus and others, this bull had a divine origin, though the exact details vary between sources, a variation that reflects different regional traditions about the same legendary creature. One common account, preserved in multiple ancient texts including Apollodorus and Diodorus, identifies this bull as the very same creature that Poseidon had sent from the sea at Minos' request. When Minos first claimed the throne of Crete, according to this well-established tradition, he prayed to Poseidon to confirm his right to rule, and the god responded by sending a magnificent white bull from the waves, a creature of such beauty and perfection that it was clearly divine. Minos was supposed to sacrifice this bull to Poseidon as thanks for the sign, but the king, overwhelmed by the animal's splendor, couldn't bring himself to kill it. He substituted a different bull for the sacrifice, keeping Poseidon's gift for his own herds. This act of impiety had consequences that rippled through Cretan mythology. According to tradition preserved by multiple authors including Apollodorus, Poseidon, enraged at this insult, caused Minos' wife Pasiphae to conceive an unnatural passion for the bull. From this cursed union, facilitated by the craftsman Daedalus, who built a wooden cow for the queen to hide within, was born the Minotaur, the half-human, half-bull monster that would be imprisoned in the labyrinth and would eventually be slain by Theseus. The white bull itself went mad, rampaging across Crete, destroying property, goring cattle and people, becoming a plague upon the very kingdom it was meant to bless. Other traditions, recorded by different authors, suggest this might be a different bull entirely, or that the creature's madness was a punishment from the gods for various transgressions. The evidence from ancient sources allows for multiple interpretations, though the connection to Poseidon and to the Minotaur's conception appears in enough accounts to be considered a well-established part of the tradition. The journey to Crete. When Heracles arrived in Crete, crossing the sea in whatever vessel he could find or persuade to carry him, he went first to King Minos to explain his mission. According to Apollodorus's detailed account, Minos gave permission for Heracles to attempt the capture, though the king offered no assistance. "Capture the bull yourself if you can," was essentially the response Minos gave, perhaps hoping this foreign hero would succeed where Cretan hunters had failed, perhaps simply wanting to be rid of the beast that had plagued his kingdom. Heracles tracked the bull across the island, following the trail of destruction it left in its wake. The trampled fields and broken fences, the places where it had gored livestock or destroyed property. When he finally found it, the confrontation was brief, according to the sources. Ancient accounts don't provide extensive detail about the actual capture, which suggests it was accomplished relatively quickly, that Heracles' strength and experience with powerful animals made this task less challenging than it might seem for an ordinary hero. The evidence from multiple sources, including Apollodorus, indicates that Heracles wrestled the bull into submission using techniques he had developed over previous labors, applying his superhuman strength and his growing understanding of animal behavior. He bound it securely, and then came the far more difficult part of the labor, transporting it from Crete to the Greek mainland. The transport and aftermath. Different ancient traditions offer varying accounts of how this transportation was accomplished. Some sources suggest Heracles literally swam across the sea with the bull, pulling it behind him through the waves, an image that strains credibility even by the standards of mythological hero tales. But that appears in enough artistic representations to be part of the tradition. Other accounts, which may be more plausible based on the evidence, suggest he commandeered or built a boat capable of transporting the animal, crossing the sea by more conventional means, though the journey would still have been dangerous with such volatile cargo. What all sources agree on is that Heracles successfully brought the bull to Mycenae, presenting it alive to Eurystheus. The king, maintaining his pattern of cowardice documented throughout the labors, fled at the sight of the raging animal. Once Eurystheus confirmed that the labor was complete from the safety of his bronze jar, the question became what to do with the bull now that it had served its purpose as proof of success. According to tradition preserved in several ancient sources, including Apollodorus, Heracles dedicated the bull to the goddess Hera, perhaps ironically given that Hera was the source of all his suffering, or perhaps as a genuine attempt to appease her wrath through this gift. Hera, however, refused the offering. She wanted nothing dedicated to her by the man she hated, nothing associated with Heracles' success or glory. Rejecting the dedication, she allowed the bull to go free. The bull, no longer restrained, began a new rampage, this time across the Greek mainland. According to traditions preserved by Apollodorus and other sources, it wandered through various regions, causing havoc wherever it went, until it eventually reached Marathon, a plain near Athens. There it became known as the Marathonian Bull, terrorizing the local population until years later when the Athenian hero Theseus would capture it and sacrifice it to Apollo, or Athena, depending on which version of that story one follows, finally ending its long career of destruction. This labor had been comparatively straightforward for Heracles, lacking the complications and tragedies that had marked many previous tasks. He had traveled far, captured what he was sent to capture, and returned successfully. It was almost as though Eurystheus had underestimated the difficulty, or perhaps the king was simply working through a list of impossible-seeming tasks without fully considering how manageable they might be for someone with Heracles' unique abilities. 7 labors complete now, by most counts, though Eurystheus maintained that only 5 had truly been fulfilled. But the pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Heracles would succeed, no matter what was demanded of him. The question was no longer whether he could complete the labors, but what price would be paid along the way, whose lives would be disrupted or destroyed as side effects of his quest for redemption that seemed to stretch longer with every victory. Labor 8. The Mares of Diomedes. The 8th labor would take Heracles far to the north, beyond the familiar Greek lands into Thrace, a region that Greeks considered barbaric, cold, and dangerous. A place where civilized laws didn't always apply, and where customs shocked the sensibilities of anyone raised in the southern cities. There, in the kingdom of the Bistones, ruled a king named Diomedes, and according to multiple sources including Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and references in various other texts, Heracles was commanded to capture his mares and bring them back to Eurystheus. But these were not ordinary horses. According to ancient sources including Apollodorus and confirmed across the tradition, the mares of Diomedes were fed on human flesh. The king, in an act of monstrous cruelty or religious perversion, depending on how one interprets his motivations from the fragmentary evidence, had trained his horses to be carnivorous, feeding them the bodies of visitors and strangers who had the misfortune to arrive in his land. The mares had become savage, unmanageable, except by Diomedes himself, so wild and vicious that they had to be bound with iron chains to their bronze mangers to prevent them from escaping and killing anyone who came near them. The idea of man-eating horses offends our sense of what is natural, crosses boundaries between categories that should remain separate. Horses are herbivores, gentle creatures when properly treated, symbols of nobility and civilization in Greek culture. To pervert them into carnivores, to teach them to hunger for human flesh, represented a profound violation of the natural order. Based on what we know from the broader context of Greek mythological thought and the consistent pattern of the labors, this task seems designed to test not just Heracles' strength, but his willingness to confront and eliminate practices that violate fundamental boundaries of civilization, to restore natural order where it had been corrupted. The capture and battle. Heracles journeyed to Thrace, possibly accompanied by friends or allies. Though the sources vary on this detail, Apollodorus mentions companions, while other traditions suggest he went alone. When he arrived at Diomedes' kingdom, he didn't announce his purpose or seek permission. Based on his actions as recorded in the sources, it appears he understood that Diomedes would never willingly surrender the mares, that asking would only alert the king and make the task more difficult. Instead, Heracles went directly to where the horses were kept, their bronze mangers fixed in place, and used his strength to overpower the guards who watched them. The mares were as savage as reported, snapping at him with their teeth, according to ancient descriptions, trying to kick and bite, their eyes rolling white, with a madness born of unnatural hunger. But Heracles was stronger than any guards, any chains, any horses. He subdued them through a combination of strength and perhaps certain techniques for handling violent animals. Methods he had developed over the course of multiple labors involving dangerous creatures. But Diomedes, learning that someone was attempting to steal his prized possessions, gathered his warriors, the Bistones, and attacked. According to Apollodorus's account, Heracles gave the mares to his companion Abderus to watch while he fought off Diomedes and his army. The battle was fierce, and Heracles, though outnumbered, eventually triumphed, killing Diomedes and scattering his followers. The tragic death of Abderus. The victory came at a terrible cost. When Heracles returned from the battle, he found that the mares had killed and partially devoured Abderus, the young man who had been watching them, who hadn't been strong enough or wary enough to prevent them from turning their unnatural hunger on their guardian. Another friend dead. Another life taken as the price of Heracles' labors. In memory of Abderus, according to traditions preserved by multiple authors including Apollodorus, Heracles founded a city near that spot, naming it Abdera after his fallen companion, ensuring that the young man would be remembered even as his body was consumed by the very creatures he had been trying to guard. Different ancient traditions provide varying accounts of what Heracles did next. Variation that reflects either different regional versions or different moral interpretations of his actions. Some sources, including references in later authors, suggest that Heracles fed Diomedes' body to the mares, an act of poetic justice or revenge, teaching the horses to be afraid by feeding them their master, breaking their wildness by forcing them to confront the consequence of their unnatural diet. Other accounts simply say that after consuming human flesh one final time, the horses became calm, their madness broken by satiety or by some transformation that feeding on their owner had wrought. According to Apollodorus, once the mares had been subdued and were no longer actively trying to kill anyone who came near them, Heracles was able to drive them back to Mycenae, presenting them to Eurystheus as proof of the labor's completion. What happened to the mares after this varies between sources. Some suggest they were released and founded a line of exceptional horses whose descendants lived for generations, their unnatural hunger forgotten or bred out over time. Others claim they were taken to Mount Olympus and dedicated to Hera or Zeus, becoming sacred animals. Still, other traditions suggest they simply died, unable to survive on normal horse food after having been trained to hunger for flesh. 8 labors now, the journeys taking Heracles farther and farther from home, the tasks becoming stranger, the consequences more unpredictable. He had defeated another tyrant, ended another perversion of nature. But the cost was another friend lost, another name to add to the growing list of those who had died because they were near him, because violence and death followed him no matter how noble his intentions or how just his cause. Labor 9. The Belt of Hippolyta. The 9th labor would take Heracles to the land of the Amazons, a journey that combined exploration, diplomacy, and ultimately, tragic misunderstanding. According to multiple ancient sources, including Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and various tragic poets, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles retrieve the golden belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons, and bring it back to Mycenae. Apollodorus specifies that Eurystheus wanted this belt not for himself, but for his daughter Edmed, who desired it as a trophy or ornament, a prize from the legendary warrior women who lived at the edge of the known world. The Amazons were a nation of female warriors who lived on the shores of the Black Sea, in regions the Greeks called Pontus or Scythia, areas that existed at the boundaries between civilization and barbarity in Greek geographical imagination. Ancient sources including Herodotus, Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and references in multiple historians and poets describe them as fierce fighters who trained from childhood in the arts of war, who could ride horses as well as any man, who wielded bows and spears and axes with deadly skill. They were said to live apart from men, meeting with neighboring tribes only briefly for reproduction, keeping their daughters and sending away or killing their sons, depending on which version of their customs one reads in different ancient accounts. Hippolyta, their queen, possessed a belt that her father Ares, god of war, had given her as a symbol of her authority, according to consistent tradition preserved across multiple sources. Though this was no ordinary belt, but a ceremonial girdle of gold, perhaps adorned with precious stones, or worked with designs showing scenes of battle and victory, though specific descriptions vary. It represented her right to rule, her status as the greatest warrior among a nation of warriors, her divine connection to the god whose bloodlust and battle joy she embodied in mortal form. The expedition. For this labor, Heracles didn't travel alone. According to various ancient traditions preserved by different authors, he gathered companions, heroes who were willing to join him on what was effectively a military expedition to foreign lands. The exact composition of this group varies significantly between sources, reflecting different traditions. Some accounts suggest that the Argonauts, fresh from their quest for the Golden Fleece, accompanied him. Others name specific heroes. Theseus appears in many accounts, as does Telamon, father of Ajax. Apollodorus provides one list of companions, while other sources provide different names. Based on the consistent pattern across sources, it appears Heracles understood this task might require negotiation, or fighting, or both, and that he wanted allies who could be trusted in either circumstance. The journey to the land of the Amazons was long, following the coast of the Black Sea to regions where few Greeks had ventured and returned to tell tales. When Heracles and his companions finally arrived, they found the Amazon city, though what exactly happened next is complicated by conflicting ancient traditions that preserve several different versions of events, suggesting either regional variations or moral debates about who was responsible for the violence that followed. The peaceful offer and Hera's betrayal. According to one account preserved by Apollodorus and echoed in other sources, Hippolyta received Heracles peacefully. When he explained his mission, told her that he had been commanded to bring back her belt as one of his labors of penance. The queen was moved by his story and his honesty. She agreed to give him the belt willingly, without battle, without conflict, recognizing in Heracles a fellow warrior who served duties higher than personal glory. This version suggests the labor could have ended without bloodshed, that diplomacy was succeeding where force would have been necessary. But Hera, the goddess who had never forgiven Heracles and who watched his labors hoping for his failure, saw this peaceful resolution and intervened. According to ancient sources including Apollodorus, she disguised herself as an Amazon and spread through the army a rumor that Heracles and his companions were kidnapping Hippolyta, that they planned to abduct the queen and carry her away by force. The Amazons, hearing this from what they believed was one of their own, assumed treachery, believed their queen was in danger and attacked. The battle that followed was confused and tragic, a conflict born of misunderstanding and divine manipulation. Heracles, seeing the Amazons charging at him armed and ready for war, had to assume that Hippolyta's offer of peace had been a ruse, that he was betrayed. In the chaos of combat, according to most traditions, Heracles killed Hippolyta, taking the belt from her body, convinced that she had been part of the deception all along. Alternative versions. Other ancient versions of this myth, preserved by different authors, tell the story differently. Variations that may reflect different regional traditions or different moral interpretations of the same event. Some suggest that a different Amazon warrior, Melanippe in some accounts or another name in others, was captured by Heracles, and Hippolyta gave up the belt as ransom for her sister's or subject's life. Others claim that the battle was planned from the start, that the Amazons never intended peace, that Hippolyta fought Heracles in single combat and was killed, her belt taken as the spoils of war. The variation in these accounts makes it difficult to determine which version, if any, represents the original telling. What we can say with certainty, based on the consistent testimony across sources, is that all versions agree Heracles obtained the belt, that this achievement came with violence against the Amazons, and that the mission involved killing or defeating some of the greatest female warriors in Greek mythology. The Troy Incident. On the journey home, according to several ancient sources, including Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus, Heracles stopped at Troy, where he found the city in crisis. King Laomedon's daughter, Hesione, had been chained to a rock near the sea as a sacrifice to a monster sent by Poseidon, payment for the king's failure to honor a promise to the gods. Heracles, seeing a woman in danger, agreed to save her if Laomedon would give him the divine horses that Zeus had once gifted to Laomedon's father, Tros, as compensation for the abduction of Ganymede. Laomedon agreed, and Heracles killed the sea monster, saving Hesione. But when the time came to pay the promised reward, Laomedon, like Augeas before him, refused to honor his word. He claimed the horses were too valuable, that Heracles deserved nothing, that the hero could leave or be driven away. Heracles, forced to continue his journey back to Mycenae with the Amazon's belt, swore revenge, promising to return someday and make Laomedon pay for his broken oath. This revenge, like that against Augeas, would come later. Heracles would indeed return with an army, sack Troy, and kill Laomedon and his sons, except for young Priam, who would grow up to be king during the later, more famous siege, when Greek armies would come again seeking vengeance and glory. When Heracles finally returned to Mycenae and presented the golden belt to Eurystheus, the king gave it to his daughter as intended. 9 labors complete by most accounts, though Eurystheus maintained his position that 2 didn't count. 3 more tasks remained, and these would be the strangest and most impossible yet, would take Heracles to the very edges of the world and beyond, to realms where mortal heroes should not be able to go and return alive. So Labor 10, the cattle of Geryon. The 10th labor would require Heracles to travel farther than he had ever gone, to the western edge of the world, to a place that existed more in mythological geography than in any physical location. According to multiple sources including Hesiod's Theogony, Apollodorus, and various later authors, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles bring back the cattle of Geryon, a monster who lived on the island of Erythea, which ancient sources place beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait we now call Gibraltar, in the great ocean that the Greeks believed encircled all lands. Geryon himself was a creature of nightmare, though ancient descriptions vary in their details of his monstrosity. Most commonly, according to Hesiod, Apollodorus, and consistent artistic tradition, he is described as having 3 heads and 3 bodies joined at the waist, a triple warrior who could fight from 3 directions simultaneously. Some artistic representations show him with wings, making him even more formidable. According to Hesiod's Theogony, he was the son of Chrysaor, who had been born from Medusa's blood when Perseus beheaded her, making Geryon part of a lineage of monsters, divine and terrible. Geryon owned a herd of magnificent red cattle, guarded by a giant herdsman named Eurytion and a 2-headed dog called Orthrus, brother to Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the Underworld, according to Hesiod. The cattle grazed on the distant island where no ordinary mortal could reach, protected by layers of impossibility. The journey itself, the monstrous guardians, and the owner who was himself a monster that no single warrior should be able to defeat. The journey west. The journey to reach Erythea became a labor in itself. Heracles traveled west through Greece, across Italy and Sicily, around the Mediterranean to its western end, a journey of months that took him through lands he had never seen, past peoples who had never heard of Mycenae or Eurystheus or the labors of penance. Ancient sources preserve various incidents from this journey, side adventures that became stories in their own right. According to some traditions preserved by authors including Apollodorus and references in other sources, when Heracles reached the narrow strait separating Europe from Africa, he was so frustrated by the length of the journey and the heat of the sun beating down on him that he drew his bow and aimed an arrow at Helios, the sun god himself, threatening to shoot down the sun if it didn't stop tormenting him. Helios, amused or impressed by this audacity, gave Heracles a golden cup or boat, a vessel that could cross the great ocean that ordinary ships couldn't navigate, that could carry the hero to islands that existed beyond the reach of normal seafaring. Before departing across ocean, according to widespread tradition, preserved in multiple sources, Heracles erected 2 great pillars at the strait, one on the European side and one on the African, marking the boundary between the known world and the realm beyond. These became known as the Pillars of Hercules, monuments that would be remembered long after the hero's death, markers that warned mariners they were approaching the edge of the civilized world. The ancient geographer Strabo and other sources preserve references to these pillars, though whether they correspond to any actual physical monuments or were purely mythological markers varies in scholarly interpretation. The battle with Geryon. Sailing across ocean in Helios's golden cup, Heracles eventually reached Erythea. There he found the herd grazing peacefully, unaware that their existence served a purpose in someone else's penance. Orthrus, the 2-headed dog, sensed Heracles' approach and attacked. But Heracles' club, he'd fashioned another after destroying previous ones, crushed the hound's skulls. Eurytion, the giant herdsman, came running at the sound of his dog's dying yelps, and Heracles killed him as well, showing no more mercy than the labor required. But these were only the outer defenses. Geryon himself, hearing the commotion, came to defend his property, his 3 heads shouting challenges, his 3 bodies moving in frightening coordination, each armed and dangerous. The battle between them would have been remarkable to witness. 3 warriors effectively fighting as one against a single opponent who had to track multiple attackers simultaneously. Heracles, according to most ancient accounts, including Apollodorus and artistic traditions, used his bow, the arrows still tipped with hydra venom from his second labor, that poison that couldn't be cured or survived. He needed to strike only once to get a single arrow past Geryon's guard and into flesh. When the arrow struck, the poison worked instantly, and the 3-bodied monster fell, died as anything mortal must die when touched by the Hydra's gift of death. The long journey home. With the guardians dead, Heracles gathered the cattle and began the long journey back. He sailed across ocean again in the Golden Cup, returning it to Helios with thanks before beginning the overland journey through the western Mediterranean with his large herd of valuable cattle. This return journey became an epic in itself, filled with adventures and complications that ancient sources preserve in varying detail. Multiple sources, including Apollodorus and Diodorus Siculus, record that Heracles drove the cattle through what would become southern France and Italy, crossing mountains and rivers, fighting off cattle thieves and bandits who saw the magnificent red herd and thought to steal them. In southern France, according to some traditions, he was attacked by the Ligurians, a local tribe, and fought them off in a battle so long and fierce that he ran out of arrows and had to pray to Zeus for help. His father sent down a rain of stones that Heracles could throw at his attackers. And the rocky plain where this battle occurred, the Crau plain near Marseille, remained forever after marked by the stones that had fallen from the sky, according to ancient geographical traditions. In Italy, various local traditions preserved stories of Heracles passing through their regions with the cattle, near the site where Rome would eventually be built. According to Roman sources, including Livy and Virgil, a giant named Cacus, who breathed fire and lived in a cave on the Aventine Hill, stole some of the cattle while Heracles slept, dragging them backward into his cave, so their tracks would suggest they had walked away from rather than toward his lair. But Heracles, hearing the bellowing of his stolen cattle echoing from the cave, tracked them down, killed Cacus, and recovered his herd. In southern Italy, according to traditions preserved in local sources, a bull broke away from the herd, swam across the strait to Sicily, and began wandering the island. Heracles had to cross over to retrieve it, adding yet another detour to his already endless journey. In Sicily, King Eryx, a son of Poseidon according to tradition, challenged Heracles to a wrestling match, with the wayward bull as the prize. Heracles agreed, won the match, and killed Eryx when the king refused to accept defeat and honor the terms. The sources that preserve these various adventures disagree about exactly which incidents occurred and in what order, suggesting that different regions created their own stories about Heracles passing through with his famous cattle, each city wanting to claim a piece of the hero's legend. What remains consistent across traditions is that the return journey was arduous, lengthy, and complicated, that bringing the cattle back to Mycenae required as much effort as obtaining them had required. The final insult. When Heracles finally arrived in Mycenae, driving the red cattle of Geryon before him after months or even years of travel, Eurystheus accepted them as proof of the labor's completion and immediately sacrificed them to Hera, according to multiple sources. The goddess who hated Heracles received as offerings the very cattle he had traveled to the world's edge to obtain. A final insult in a labor that had required extraordinary endurance just to complete. 10 labors finished by most reckonings, though Eurystheus insisted that only 8 counted. 2 more tasks remained on the king's list, and these would be the strangest of all, would require Heracles to obtain things that perhaps shouldn't be obtained, to go places where the living shouldn't go, to test not just his strength and courage, but the very boundaries between the mortal world and realms beyond mortal reach. Labor 11, the Apples of the Hesperides. The 11th labor took Heracles on a quest that would span the known world and beyond, searching for something whose location was secret, whose guardians were divine, whose very existence tested the boundaries between mortal and immortal, earth and heaven. According to multiple sources including Apollodorus, Pherecydes, and various poetic traditions, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles bring back 3 golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, a place that existed at the western edge of the world, where the sunset and eternal twilight reigned. The garden of the Hesperides was sacred to Hera herself. According to traditions preserved in Apollodorus and other sources, when she married Zeus, Gaia, the earth, had given her a wedding gift of a tree that grew golden apples, fruits of immortality or at least of divine power. Hera had planted this tree in a garden at the world's edge, where it was tended by the Hesperides, nymphs of the evening, daughters of the night, or perhaps of Atlas, depending on which genealogy one follows. The tree was also guarded by Ladon, a dragon with 100 heads that never slept, that coiled around the trunk and hissed, with voices that could sound like any creature that ever lived, according to poetic descriptions. The task seemed impossible not because of the guardian, though Ladon was formidable, but because no one knew exactly where the garden was. Ancient sources, including Apollodorus, preserve various traditions about how Heracles found it, suggesting that even in antiquity, there were multiple versions of this part of the quest, each adding different adventures and encounters to the hero's journey. The search for knowledge. According to some accounts preserved by Apollodorus and others, Heracles first sought advice from the sea god Nereus, the old man of the sea, who possessed prophetic knowledge and could reveal the garden's location. But Nereus, like many prophetic beings, was difficult to consult because he could change shape, becoming fire or water or any creature, slipping from the grasp of anyone trying to hold him. Heracles had to physically wrestle with Nereus through all his transformations, never letting go no matter what form the god assumed, until finally Nereus gave up the struggle and revealed what Heracles needed to know. Other traditions, preserved by various authors, suggest different paths to knowledge. Some claim Heracles encountered the giant Antaeus in Libya, a son of Poseidon and Gaia, who forced all travelers to wrestle with him, killing those he defeated and using their skulls to build a temple to his father. Antaeus was unbeatable as long as he touched the earth, his mother, who renewed his strength constantly. Heracles realized this and lifted Antaeus into the air, crushing him in a bear hug, while the giant's feet dangled helplessly above the ground, unable to draw power from Gaia's embrace. In Egypt, according to traditions preserved by Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, and other authors, Heracles was captured by King Busiris, a tyrant who had received an oracle saying that sacrificing a foreigner each year would end a famine in his land. Busiris chose to sacrifice Greeks specifically, and when Heracles arrived, the king had him seized and brought to the altar. But Heracles broke his bonds at the last moment, killed Busiris and his priests, and escaped, demonstrating that no mortal king, no matter how cruel or powerful, could hold him against his will. Atlas and the Garden. Eventually, through whatever path of adventure and inquiry, Heracles learned that the garden lay near where Atlas held up the sky. According to well-established tradition preserved in Hesiod, Apollodorus, and multiple other sources, Atlas was one of the Titans, condemned by Zeus after the war between the Titans and Olympians to stand forever at the western edge of the world, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders, ensuring that sky and earth didn't collapse back together into primordial chaos. He stood there still, would stand there until the end of time, his punishment eternal and inescapable. When Heracles found Atlas, sources differ on exactly what happened next, preserving two main traditions. In one version, Heracles killed or put to sleep the dragon Ladon himself and took the apples, then brought them to where Atlas stood and showed them to the Titan as proof of what he had done. In the other version, more commonly told and more interesting in its complications, Heracles asked Atlas to retrieve the apples for him, offering to hold up the sky temporarily while the Titan took a break from his eternal burden. The trick and counter-trick. According to this well-known tradition preserved in Apollodorus and multiple other sources, Atlas eagerly agreed. For the first time in ages beyond counting, he could move freely, could stretch muscles that had been locked in place for eons, could walk without the weight of the heavens pressing down on his shoulders. He went to the garden, presumably immune to the dragon's guard since he was related to the Hesperides, or perhaps because Ladon recognized him as belonging to that realm, and returned with 3 golden apples as requested. But then Atlas, feeling freedom for the first time since the war with Zeus, had a thought that should have been predictable based on his situation. "I'll take these apples to Eurystheus myself," he told Heracles according to the traditional account. "You just keep holding the sky. You're doing so well at it." This was a test, a trap, a moment where Heracles had to think quickly, because if he simply accepted Atlas's betrayal, he would be condemned to replace the Titan, to stand forever holding up the heavens while Atlas walked free. Heracles, thinking fast according to the cleverness that multiple sources attribute to him throughout the Labors, agreed with apparent resignation. "You're right," he said, according to Apollodorus. "I'll stay here. But could you just hold the sky for a moment while I put a cushion on my shoulders? This is really uncomfortable." Atlas, eager to be rid of the burden and not thinking clearly in his joy at freedom, agreed and took back the sky. Once the weight was back on the Titan's shoulders, Heracles picked up the apples and left, calling back thanks and perhaps apologies as he hurried away before Atlas could realize he had been tricked. This version of the myth, preserved in multiple ancient sources, reveals something important about how the Greeks understood Heracles. He wasn't just strong and brave, but clever when necessary, capable of outwitting even immortal beings when his strength alone wouldn't suffice. The labor required not just obtaining the apples, but escaping the trap that obtaining them had created. And Heracles succeeded through intelligence as much as through any physical prowess. The return. The journey back to Mycenae was straightforward compared to the outward quest. Heracles brought the golden apples to Eurystheus, who accepted them as proof of the 11th labor's completion. But the apples were holy to Hera, were divine objects that couldn't remain in mortal hands. According to Apollodorus, Athena took the apples from Eurystheus and returned them to the garden of the Hesperides, restoring them to their proper place, maintaining the order of sacred things that shouldn't be permanently possessed by mortals, no matter how heroic. 11 labors complete, though Eurystheus counted only 9. 1 labor remained, and it would be the most impossible of all, would require Heracles to descend into the underworld itself, to walk among the dead, to face the boundary between life and death, and return with proof that he had crossed it. The final labor wouldn't test his strength or his cleverness, but his very existence, his right to live, his relationship with mortality itself. Labor 12. Cerberus, the Hound of Hades. The 12th and final labor was simple in its statement and impossible in its implications. According to multiple sources including Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, and references in various tragic poets, Eurystheus commanded that Heracles descend into the underworld, the realm of the dead, and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades, ensuring that the dead remained dead, that no soul escaped back to the world of the living. It was a task that, by its very nature, required the hero to confront death itself, to walk where the living shouldn't walk, and to return from a place that was, by definition, the place from which no one returns. According to ancient sources including Apollodorus and Pausanias, Heracles prepared for this labor as one prepares for death. He sought out Eumolpus at Eleusis, the center of the Eleusinian mysteries, those sacred rites that promised initiates knowledge about death and the afterlife. Based on what ancient sources tell us about the requirements for entering the underworld alive, it appears that Heracles underwent initiation into these mysteries, learning whatever secrets they conveyed, preparing his spirit for the journey into the land of the dead. This initiation was necessary, the ancient sources imply, because entering the underworld alive required more than physical strength. It required knowledge of how to navigate between the living and the dead without becoming trapped in that liminal space. The descent. Different traditions preserve varying accounts of how Heracles found the entrance to the underworld. Some place it at Taenarum in southern Greece, a cave from which no explorers had ever emerged, where local tradition claimed one could hear the voices of the dead echoing up from below. Others suggest he entered through a chasm at Hermione, or through gates in the western lands, where the sun set and darkness came from the earth itself. The variation suggests that in Greek thought, there were multiple entrances to the underworld, that the boundary between life and death wasn't a single locked door, but a permeable membrane that existed in many places, thin enough in certain locations that one could pass through if properly prepared. Accompanied by Hermes, the god who guided souls to the underworld and could therefore guide a living man there as well, and protected by Athena, his divine patron, Heracles descended according to Apollodorus and the tradition. The journey down was a passage through darkness that deepened with every step, through cold that increased beyond what any living place could achieve, through a landscape that became progressively less real and more like memory or dream or nightmare. He passed the river Styx, the boundary water that separated the living world from the dead. Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across for the price of a coin placed beneath their tongues at burial, initially refused to transport Heracles because he was alive, because his presence in this realm was an offense against the natural order, according to the account. But Heracles glared at him with such intensity, or perhaps showed him some token from the mysteries, and Charon relented, ferrying him across, though the ancient sources suggest the ferryman was later punished by Hades for allowing a living man to enter the realm of the dead. Among the shades, on the far shore, according to Apollodorus and Homer's Odyssey, which provides parallel accounts of living heroes in the underworld, Heracles encountered the shades of the dead, souls that drifted like smoke, insubstantial, their features barely recognizable, their voices barely audible. They fled from him, terrified of this living man who blazed with vital energy in a place where nothing lived, where everything had already ended. Only two shades didn't flee, according to the tradition, Meleager and Medusa. Medusa, the Gorgon whose severed head Perseus had used as a weapon years before, appeared to Heracles as a shade, and he drew his sword in instinctive defense, according to Apollodorus, forgetting momentarily that she was already dead, that her petrifying gaze had no power here, where everything was already stone still, already frozen in death. Hermes told him to put away his sword, that she was only a phantom, that in the underworld no shade could harm him as long as he didn't permit it. Meleager's shade spoke with him, told Heracles about his sister Deianira, according to multiple sources, and Heracles promised to marry her if he survived and returned to the world of the living. This promise would later have consequences that Heracles couldn't foresee, would lead to his own death years hence, through a chain of causation that began with this conversation among the dead, would close the circle that began with madness and murder and his children's blood. The confrontation with Hades, Heracles pressed deeper into the underworld, past Meleager in the fleeing shades, past the judges who weighed souls and assigned them to their proper places in the afterlife, past fields of asphodel, where ordinary souls spent eternity in a kind of gray half-existence, neither rewarded nor punished, until he came to the throne room of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead. Here, ancient sources preserve what may be the most remarkable element of this entire labor. According to Apollodorus's detailed account, Heracles asked Hades for permission to take Cerberus, and Hades agreed, on one condition. Heracles could take the hound if he could overpower it without using any weapons, using only his bare hands and his strength, and if he promised to return Cerberus afterward, not to keep the guardian of the underworld permanently in the world above. The fact that Hades negotiated at all, that the king of the dead treated with this mortal hero, rather than simply condemning him for trespassing in a forbidden realm, suggests something important about Heracles' status by this point in his labors. Based on this divine acknowledgement and similar respect shown by other gods throughout his journey, it appears he was not quite mortal anymore, or perhaps he was so thoroughly mortal, so completely committed to his path of penance and purification, that even the gods of death recognized something in him that demanded respect rather than punishment. The capture of Cerberus. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates of the underworld, where the three-headed hound stood eternal watch, ensuring that the dead stayed dead, that no soul escaped back to life. Descriptions of Cerberus vary between ancient sources, but most agree on the three heads, each capable of biting independently, each alert and watching in a different direction simultaneously. Some accounts, including references in Hesiod and artistic traditions, add serpents growing from his body, a mane of living snakes, or a snake for a tail, elaborating the monster into something progressively more nightmarish. Without weapons, using only his hands according to the terms Hades had set, Heracles grappled with Cerberus. The fight must have been terrible beyond imagining, based on how ancient sources describe the aftermath. The hero wrestling with a creature of death itself, choking its throats one by one, avoiding the snapping jaws that could tear flesh from bone, enduring the bites and scratches that drew his blood in the place where blood shouldn't flow, where life shouldn't pulse. But Heracles was stronger, and eventually, through sheer physical power and endurance, he forced Cerberus into submission, bound the hound, and began the long climb back to the surface with death's guardian in chains. The return to light, the return journey from the underworld, dragging Cerberus behind him, brought Heracles back through all the levels he had descended, back across the Styx, back past Charon, back through the darkness that gradually lightened as he approached the boundary between death and life. When he emerged, according to various ancient sources, the light of day was almost unbearable after the darkness below, and Cerberus, who had never seen daylight, howled and thrashed at the brightness, trying to escape back into the comfortable dark. Some traditions preserved in ancient botanical texts add a detail about this emergence, where Cerberus's drool fell on the ground as Heracles dragged him upward. Poisonous plants sprang up, specifically aconite or wolfsbane, a deadly toxin used in ancient times for poisoning arrows and assassinating enemies. Even in defeat, even in captivity, the Hound of Death brought death with him, marked the world above with his presence, left scars in the living lands. The final proof. Heracles brought Cerberus to Mycenae, presented him to Eurystheus as proof that the 12th labor was complete, that he had descended into death and returned, that he had captured the uncapturable, that he had done what no mortal had ever done before. Eurystheus, seeing the three-headed hound of Hades standing before him, collapsed in terror. The sources don't record what he said, if he said anything coherent, but all agree that he confirmed the labor was complete, that Heracles had fulfilled his obligations, that the 12 labors, after years of effort and travel to every edge of the world and beyond, were finally finished. Heracles, as he had promised Hades according to Apollodorus, returned Cerberus to the underworld, bringing the guardian back to his post at the gates of death, restoring the order that his labor had temporarily disrupted. The hound resumed his eternal watch, and the boundary between life and death was sealed again. Death made secure once more after this brief interruption by a living hero who had proven that even the final boundary, even death itself, couldn't stop him when he was committed to a task. The aftermath, what redemption really means. The labors were complete. 12 impossible tasks, each one designed to be fatal, each one requiring strength beyond any mortal measure, cunning beyond ordinary human wit, courage beyond what should be asked of anyone. According to multiple sources, including Apollodorus and various tragic poets, Heracles had faced monsters and gods, had traveled to the world's edge and beyond, had descended into death itself and returned. He had done what no other hero had ever done, what legends would speak of for thousands of years to come. But what had he accomplished? What had he gained? According to ancient sources, Heracles was declared free of guilt after completing the labors. The oracle's decree was fulfilled, the penance served, the blood debt paid. He could resume his life, or what remained of it, no longer bound by the commands of Eurystheus, no longer required to undertake tasks at the whim of a lesser man. But freedom from obligation didn't mean freedom from consequences. The labors had changed Heracles, had hardened him, had taught him that violence followed him everywhere, that people died around him. He had caused the centaurs' deaths at Pholoe, had buried Abderus, who had been eaten by the mares of Diomedes. The pattern throughout his labors suggests that redemption, if it came at all, came at a terrible price paid mostly by others. After the labors, according to extensive traditions preserved by multiple authors, Heracles continued his adventures. He helped the gods fight against the giants when those ancient enemies of Olympus rose again. He participated in the quest of the Argonauts in some traditions. He fulfilled his vow to return to Elis and make King Augeas pay for refusing to honor their agreement, returning with an army, killing the king, and giving the throne to Phileus. He carried out his promised revenge against King Laomedon of Troy, besieging the city and killing Laomedon, setting the stage for the later, more famous siege. And he married again. He remembered the promise he had made to Meleager's shade in the Underworld and sought out Deianira, who became his second wife, who loved him, who tried to keep him, who would ultimately cause his death through love and jealousy and a tragic misunderstanding. The death of a hero. The ancient sources record that when Heracles died, not in battle, not facing a monster, but through poisoning from a robe soaked in what Deianira believed was a love potion, but was actually the venomous blood of the centaur Nessus, whom Heracles had killed years before with his Hydra-poisoned arrows. His mortal body burned on a funeral pyre on Mount Oeta. According to the tradition preserved in Apollodorus, Sophocles, Trachiniae, and other sources, his divine spirit, the part of him that was Zeus's son, ascended to Mount Olympus. The gods welcomed him as one of their own, and even Hera, whose hatred had driven him to madness, and through 12 labors of penance, was finally reconciled to him. He married the goddess Hebe, personification of youth, and lived forever among the immortals, a reward for all his sufferings, an ending that provided the redemption that the labors alone hadn't delivered. But this divine apotheosis came only through death. The man who had survived everything that gods and mortals could devise, who had faced death in the underworld and forced it to release him, who seemed invincible and eternal, was killed by the consequences of his own past actions, by violence he had committed years before, coming back to destroy him through the innocent agency of a wife who loved him and wanted only to keep his love from straying. Conclusion: the labor that never ends. As we reach the end of this journey through the 12 labors of Hercules, let your breathing deepen one final time. Let the weight of these ancient truths settle gently around you. We've walked with this hero from the moment of his terrible madness to the completion of his final, impossible task, from the blood of his children to the gates of the underworld and back. But here's the truth that takes 3,000 years to fully understand. The labors didn't redeem Heracles. They couldn't, because you can't earn back the lives you've taken. You can't complete enough tasks to resurrect murdered children. You can't suffer your way to innocence. The oracle's promise of redemption through service was, perhaps, the kindest lie ever told. A way to give a broken man something to do with his hands and his strength, while time slowly dulled the sharpest edges of his guilt. What the labors did do was give Heracles purpose when despair threatened to destroy him. They gave him a path to walk when the alternative was collapse. They gave him impossible challenges that were somehow more bearable than sitting still with his memories. They gave him a story that was about something other than the worst thing he'd ever done. And perhaps that's the real lesson. We don't complete impossible tasks to earn redemption. We complete them because completing them is how we survive the weight of being human. Every person who's ever done something unforgivable understands Heracles. Every person who's wondered if enough penance equals enough peace knows his story from the inside. We all carry labors, tasks that seem impossible, burdens that feel unbearable, paths of atonement that stretch longer with each step. Heracles completed his 12 labors, killed the unkillable, captured the uncapturable, descended into death itself, and returned. And when his mortal body finally burned, his divine spirit ascended to Olympus. Even Hera forgave him. He married youth itself and lived forever. But this transformation came only through death, only through complete destruction of everything he'd been. The strongest man who ever lived couldn't save himself from his own story. And maybe that's the point. Maybe heroism isn't succeeding at impossible tasks. It's attempting them anyway. It's continuing despite incomplete redemption. It's refusing to let the worst thing you've done be the only thing you are. 3,000 years later, Heracles' name still means impossible made possible. His story still speaks to anyone who carries guilt, seeks redemption, walks paths of penance toward destinations that may not exist. He teaches us that persistence itself is the labor. The attempt itself is the redemption. The refusal to give up, even when peace never fully comes. That is the true labor of Heracles, and it's the labor we all share. So rest now, knowing that your own impossible tasks matter because you attempt them, your persistence, your refusal to surrender to despair, your determination to continue, that is heroism. Not the completion, the continuation. Good night. And may your own labors find you as strong, as persistent, and as ultimately transcendent as the hero who faced 12 impossible tasks and emerged, if not redeemed, then at least transformed by the attempt. The 12 labors are complete. The story ends. But the lesson continues, carried forward by everyone who refuses to stop trying, who seeks redemption knowing it may never fully come, who carries unbearable burdens anyway. One step at a time, one labor at a time, until the journey itself becomes its own reward. Thank you for walking this path with Hercules. Remember, the greatest labor isn't completing the impossible, it's continuing to try, rest, transform, endure.